Welcome to the top 12 highlights from Chapter 11. Today we're looking at the legislative branch, and thank you for joining me. Let's start off by looking at reapportionment. This is the idea that after the census, which happens every 10 years, basically we reapportion those 435 House seats. We basically take the total population, divide it by 435, and that tells us how many districts are in each state based on their total population from the census. Every 10 years means 2020 will be the next year the census will be conducted, and then reapportionment will take place after that census is complete. We'll do it again in 2030, just as we did in 2010. We'll do it every 10 years. This changes the pace of growth. Everywhere is growing, some places not growing as fast as others. And so you'll see here in the red, for instance, Texas gaining seats, 4 seats they gained in 2010. And the Rust Belt, where a lot of the manufacturing was taking place, they actually lost a lot of seats. So reapportionment is what happens first. Then the census basically will tell people that the leadership in the state, these are the number of seats you have. Maryland, you have 8 seats. Maryland, you again will probably have 8 seats because your growth is at a pace that is growing, but not growing as fast as other places. Where do we see a lot of the growth? In the South and in the Southwest. Really, those are the areas that we see most of the growth happening. So then what happens is each state will then redistrict based on the reapportionment information from the census. They'll redraw the lines to make sure that every district in each state, every district in each state is equal in value, so that each one pretty much measures the other. Now in 2010, the total population was roughly about 760-some thousand people. So we'll see how that translates to 2020. But the idea is each district then needs to be redrawn so that the total number of people in that district matches the total number of people in all the other districts all across the country. All 435 districts essentially mirroring similarly. Now, some exceptions to this would include a state that only has 3 electoral votes, meaning they only have 1 House seat. So the entire state then is the seat. And some of the states that you know, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, those would be states that would only have 1, and they would continue per the Constitution. Article 1 says they always get at least 1 vote, which is why D.C. also has 1. So then the states can do their magic in terms of how they redraw those district lines. Whoever's in charge, Supreme Court has said, looking at the Wisconsin case and the Maryland case, a Republican redistricting and a Democratic redistricting, respectively, basically look at that and gerrymander to their party's favor. And while we're still kind of hashing through the North Carolina situation in terms of redrawing those lines, in Maryland and in Wisconsin, they said that those may be partisan in nature, but they are constitutional in nature. So gerrymandering is alive and well. Long live gerrymandering. Baker versus Carr basically was the Supreme Court ruling that said malapportionment is unconstitutional. Basically, every state needs to redraw the lines, needs to redistrict. Just because you did it 10 years ago doesn't mean that the districts are the same. They need to be updated. In this case, the districts in Tennessee hadn't been redrawn since 1901. That's a very long time for districts to not undergo change, and that leads to some districts that have more power, voting power, than others. So the idea here is 1 person equals 1 vote. When reapportionment takes place after the census is completed, redistricting also needs to take place, and that redistricting needs to be drawn so that each district is equal in nature to all of the other districts in the state and all of the other districts across the country in those 435 House seats. So the significance of this case is basically saying 1 person equals 1 vote no matter where you are. So if you move today from Maryland and you go to Washington State, your vote should count just as much in Washington State as it does here in the state of Maryland. And that was essentially what the Supreme Court was trying to guarantee. They were saying under the Tennessee Tennessee's inability to redistrict, they weren't following the 1 person, 1 vote rule. according to the Constitution, and that is what we call malapportionment, and it is unconstitutional. You can see here a couple of maps that, while maybe sketchy in nature, they kind of look like pterodactyls or other types of unique birds, extinct birds. They were ruled to be constitutional. Gerrymandering is, as long as it is concise, contiguous, and compact. I know compact could be questionable here, but the Supreme Court has upheld it and said that it is constitutional in nature, at least for now. Shaw v. Reno was the idea of trying to, remember I said that they need to be concise, contiguous, and compact. The other thing is that they cannot pack a district of minorities in order to skew their vote, where they would have power in two districts, packing them all into one district, the minority voters there, or splitting them up, what we call cracking. Packing and cracking, unconstitutional according to Shaw v. Reno. Supreme Court basically stepping in and saying whether you're trying to pack them in order to dilute their vote, or whether you're trying to crack them up to dilute their vote entirely. And both of those are unconstitutional. They are violations of the Constitution and its Equal Protection Clause. Switching over to going back to Congress then, in terms of other types, we think of gerrymandering, but other types of advantages that incumbents, people that are elected officials have, is the franking privilege, probably most common. Except for 90 days before an election, they can send out anything they want to you. A newsletter to let you know about things, or a mailing, letters to constituents, casework, that sort of thing. They're able to do that. They have the name advantage, so that they can get on the news and talk about, hey, I'm your congressman from this number district. They have the ability to do that. They can also hold rubber chicken dinners. They can talk to interest groups. They can raise a lot of money that way, and they do. And they do. And they have the experience to be able to say, well, I've been in Congress. I know how it works. I know what you need and how I can help. My opponent doesn't have that background in nature. So that does tend to help in their talking with voters, to know, hey, he knows what's going on in Washington. He's going to go and he's trying to fix things, trying to change things. And how do I know that? Because of constituent services. He's trying to help us out, trying to take care of governmental matters in order to help the people. And not just help the people in terms of the issues they need, but also to bring home the bacon, bring home projects and government funds that are earmarks or pork, that can help the district in great detail, to bring more money back to the district. That is always beneficial to a member of Congress, to be able to say, hey, that $12 million contract, we're happy to report that it's been approved, and the Department of Defense is going to do that right here in our district. That's $12 million coming home to our district. Now vote for me, is kind of the mindset behind it. Okay, pluralism versus bicameralism. Remember, pluralism, in Federalist 51, we talked about the separation of powers. And James Madison saying, hey, we can keep government in check by separating the powers, but also separating the levels of government: national, state, and local government, executive, legislative, and judicial. We can really break up the power that way and keep anybody from gaining too much power. Bicameralism also does that, because you have an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the People's House, the House of Representatives. And they have to agree on bills. If they don't approve the exact same legislation in both chambers, it can't go to the president. It's got to be approved by both chambers in order to do that. And we'll talk more about that later. But there are differences, and we'll talk about the differences in the House and the Senate in terms of how they conduct business, their demographic and constitutional makeup. And Congress was designed to be, all branches are equal, but Congress was designed to be the dominant branch of government in terms of where laws were happening. They're responsible for making those laws. The executive branch was responsible for carrying them out, for enforcing them, and then the judicial branch to interpret them in terms of their constitutionality. So it's really Congress's job, which is why there's 535 of those people, is really to really pore over these issues, really debate the issues, talk about the issues, research the issues, hold hearings, call in expert witnesses and get testimony and really get to the heart of the matter, deliberate on these topics and really find the best laws to be made out there in order to make those happen. That was really what it was designed to do. And bicameralism was designed to get those bodies to agree so that whatever came out of Congress would be sound legislation, would be solid, well vetted, and ready to be executed by the executive branch legislation that would stand the test of time. So I'm not going to go into great detail on the powers of the Congress here through the elastic clause and the enumerated powers that are listed here. In Article 1, Section 8, you can pause and go through that yourself. But the idea here is Congress has specific enumerated powers. If it's not enumerated here, it better fall under that last one, number 18, the necessary and proper clause, what we think of as elastic in that we stretch it to fit whatever it is we want to, or under their ability to regulate commerce. But otherwise, Congress doesn't have the power. The power falls to the states. It becomes the reserve powers of the states under the 10th Amendment. And that really is by design that Madison wrote it that way, that it would only be through the powers that were enumerated. And we can see, today a lot coming from necessary and proper, a lot coming from the Commerce Clause in terms of carrying that out in number 3 here. But a lot of it, if it's not enumerated, it's not spelled out, then it's supposed to be reserved for the states. So some differences, and again, I won't go through these in great detail, but the biggest difference is the size. We have a House of 435 members, a Senate of 100. In the House, they're elected every 2 years, in the Senate every 6. The idea is a senator is elected by the statewide, the majority rules, or the most the most people to vote for them if there's more than 2 people in the race. And in the House, it's districts that are gerrymandered by whoever is in charge of the state legislature. They are responsible for the House is responsible for any type of legislation that involves budgeting, tax changes, raising revenue or cutting taxes. Any of that would have to be done through the House of Representatives. The Senate will ultimately vote on it. But the idea is if you're going to raise taxes on the people, it's got to be the people's house that approves those messages. There is a much stricter debate in the House of Representatives because, as you can imagine, having 435 people, nobody gets to speak all the time on every bill. The idea is you get to speak at certain times on certain bills, and the Rules Committee establishes all that on behalf of the Speaker of the House, who basically dictates what happens there. The Speaker has sweeping powers in the House of Representatives. Not so in the Senate. We have a member, the President pro tempore, which is in line of succession if the President, Vice President, and Speaker of the House were to be incapacitated or killed, that the President pro tempore would become power. I have a picture coming up of that Senator, Chuck Grassley. But the Senate is a much less formal body in terms of being able to speak and let everyone speak their mind and speaking without limit in terms of how much time you want to speak there. So they have much more freedom to do that, and that gives them the ability to take a much broader view on issues. In the House, where the master of certain trades, in the Senate, you're the jack of all trades. The debate here is limited in that members can speak, and unless you're going to filibuster a bill, you're usually able to speak at the time that you need. And a lot of times those limits on any type of debate would be unanimous consent, and it's a pretty agreeable body on that front unless there's legislation they're trying to stymie or slow down, or the minority is trying to kill, that's being led by the majority leader who runs most of that legislation, and we'll talk about those individuals here in just a second. But those are some of the differences between the two. So the Speaker of the House, as I said, has sweeping powers. They set the agenda. They basically preside over the body. They run the Rules Committee, basically telling the Rules Committee what goes when, and basically the Rules Committee carrying out the agenda of the Speaker. Majority Leader and the Majority Whip also carrying out the Speaker of the House's policy agenda in terms of importance, and in line of succession. If the President and Vice President were to pass away, the Speaker of the House would become President of the United States. We have not had that case, luckily, that's ever happened, but that is part of the line of succession under the 25th Amendment. In terms of House leadership, right now we have Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and we talked about this yesterday in voting on the impeachment inquiry. The idea here is that the Speaker has sweeping powers. She is helping her lead this organization of majority Democrats is the Majority Leader from Maryland, Steny Hoyer, and Majority Whip James Clyburn. Majority Whip kind of getting a pulse of what the party is thinking, counting the votes, seeing who's there, and how much support they can get. Then we have, and that's leading up the majority in power, the most in power, which would be the Democrats in the House. And then in the minority, we have the Republicans, and the Minority Leader is Kevin McCarthy, also of California. And the Minority Whip, the counter of the votes, the kind of corralling the troops to vote the party line, would be Steve Scalise from Louisiana. So this is the House leadership in terms of carrying out the majority and minority's message. In terms of what they do there. The Rules Committee is going to establish a lot of how legislation gets carried out, what committees it goes to, and then what bills get brought up for debate on the floor, how long they get to debate, who gets to speak, how long their speaking times, and that sort of thing. Very different in the Senate, where it's much more open-ended. And in the House, we have all of the seats, all 435, up every 2 years. You have to run every 2 years. Every other year, you're up for re-election. In the Senate, not so. Only a third of those seats are open for election, and a third at a time, 1/3 every 2 years, so that ultimately 33, 33, 34, and then all 100 members ultimately over that 6-year cycle. But the idea is 1/3 every year, so that the Senate isn't seeing a huge change overnight. It's more of a deliberative body that is slower to the pace of change. In terms of that type of legislation. In the Senate, as I said, the Vice President actually is the presider over the Senate, but that is rare, usually only in the case of ties. The President pro tempore is the ex officio member in terms of succession. They're next in line after the Speaker of the House to take over as President, but also they are the longest-serving member of the majority party, and in this case, Republicans are controlling the majority. The oldest-serving member, or the longest-serving member of the majority party of the Republicans is Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa. So he serves in that role. Now, notice the Senate is smaller, only 100 members, so it's a lot easier to kind of maintain control. So you don't need a Rules Committee over here. You can kind of work things out among the body, working with the majority and minority leader. And it is a more deliberative body. They do a lot more talking and debating and asking questions of each other and that sort of thing, and filibustering. But the idea here is they are designed to balance out the passions of the House. The idea of the tyranny of the majority, the passions of the House are chilled in the Senate, are cooled off in the Senate, because the idea here is that you're supposed to deliberate over those items, cooling down those tensions and protecting minority rights. So in the majority rules in the House, the minority is protected in the Senate. And this used to be a body that was elected by state legislatures. Now the 17th Amendment changed that, in which now it's directly elected by the people, according to the 17th Amendment. So that is kind of a change. And who do we see in the Senate these days? We see, as I mentioned, Chuck Grassley from Iowa as Senate President pro tempore. More of an official role, but again, important in the line of presidential succession. But otherwise, in terms of serving at the dais with the gavel, that would be whoever's filling in for Senate President pro tempore. But who is running the agenda? It's the majority leader, and that is Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. His whip, John Thune from South Dakota, they control the agenda in the Senate. The majority leader has a lot of power in the Senate, just like the Speaker has power in the House. The Republicans are in control of the majority here in the Senate, and so the majority leader and whip are Republicans. The minority is the Democrats in this case, and Chuck Schumer of New York and Dick Durbin of Illinois round out the leadership in the Senate. They lead the Democrats in the minority, the loyal opposition, if you will. And so the majority leader and minority leader are the ones getting together on the agenda in terms of when bills are brought up, coordinating things in terms of debate. But it is the majority leader who has the power in terms of bringing that up. The minority leader, again, is the loyal opposition. The filibuster. It is not a constitutionally. It is not found in the Constitution. It is not a constitutionally protected right. So to adjust it in order to allow for more legislation or more debate is to vote for cloture is something that people always say, oh, the filibuster, it's constitutional, it's in our history. Well, it is in our history, but it isn't constitutional. And so the idea is you can talk a bill to death by filibustering it, but you can also vote for cloture. And usually you need 3/5. Today, when it started, you needed 2/3. Now you only need 60 votes. And actually in some in the judicial proceedings now for federal judges, you only need 50%. You only need one more than half. So 51 votes, which does it make it easier for the majority to basically kill a filibuster and get some of their nominees passed, which is why, as I said in class, President Trump has appointed 1 in 6 judges that are sitting on the federal bench today because of changes in the filibuster rules. Now, it wasn't the Republicans that changed those rules, in fairness. Let's talk about Harry Reid, who was the majority leader at the time for the Democrats. In order to get President Obama's nominees through, he and the Democrats in the majority changed the Senate rules, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader at the time, said, you will rue the day that this happens because it is going to, you're going to regret it. And when President Trump was elected and all of the Republican nominees started coming in, Mitch McConnell said, yes, see, I told you so. And that was because of the changes to that filibuster rule for judicial nominees. Otherwise, legislation sticks to the 3/5 rule, but in the federal judicial nominees stick to the majority rule. So committees, oh my goodness, all the committees that we have in Congress. Standing committees being the most obvious, the ones with the signs on the door. They're permanent. They're meant to stay, and there are many of them. Things like Ways and Means, dealing with tax revenue and budget bills. Those like the Armed Services, dealing with foreign policy issues, or Intelligence, dealing with matters of national security. So those are all standing committees. Now, a joint committee is one in which you have House and Senate members. Maybe they're looking at something in particular. Or a select committee looking at Benghazi, or looking at the special committee on 9/11. Those are temporary. They come in for a particular period of time. They do what they needed, what they were created to do, and then they go away. So no signs on the door for them. And then a conference committee is basically brought together by House and Senate members to reconcile differences in their bills. So if the House and Senate don't pass the exact same bill, they put them together in order to put the conference committee together in order to try and iron out the differences. And that really is what happens here in terms of getting both the House and the Senate to vote up or down on legislation, because they have to pass the exact same bill. And if they can do that, then it would go onto the president's desk for signing, or veto, or pocket veto. And the idea here is that the majority party picks and would have a majority in each of the committees, and that goes in for the House as well as the Senate. A caucus is a little different. It's kind of like an interest group, but it's among members of Congress. So we talked about an Iowa caucus, which is much different, very different than this. A caucus in a congressional caucus, like the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, is those of like-mindedness. They have a similar issue or the agenda that they want to carry out, and so they get together on occasion and talk about those issues in terms of how they're moving their agenda forward. So those are two, some of the most common, and you can see some others here as well. But a lot of Congress outside of committees functions in caucuses in order to try and move forward particular agendas that they're passionate about, things they want to do on behalf of the voters. In terms of the legislative process, you've gone through this in great detail. I'm not going to belabor that here, but I would say pause and take a look at the legislative process once again in case you have questions. You can always go to Schoolhouse Rock and look at that. And you can always go back to the broader lessons from the yellow sheet and blue sheet that have much more detail on the legislative process. Part 2 actually began talking all about the legislative process, so I encourage you to do that. Don't forget a closed rule. There's a time limit on debate, no amendments, and no other no other types of things to get you off track. Open rule, you can add amendments, people can talk, people can speak. There's all kinds of things, which is why we don't have many of those open rules. And then restrictive rule, there may be some amendments allowed, but it's a permission-based process. So a little different in that regard. And the only thing that can get a bill out of committee, other than the committee itself voting for it, would be a discharge petition, and that is designed to, only in the House, to bring it to the floor, and you would need a majority vote in order to do that. Resolutions. A simple one could be as simple as affecting something within the House. You're passing a National Day of the Sunflower. That would be a pretty simple resolution. A concurrent, both houses are doing it. Maybe a resolution on a particular event happening like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor Day or something like that. And then a joint resolution would be one that would be signed by the president, because most resolutions wouldn't be. They have the full force of law, but they're usually ceremonial in nature. There's really not a whole lot to carry out in terms of execution. It doesn't usually involve the passing of money, or it would need to be a law. And then a constitutional amendment would be a joint resolution, but that goes to the states, not to the president. The president has no role in a joint resolution that would be a constitutional amendment to the actual Constitution. So how do members of Congress represent their constituents? Well, there's two models here. There's the trustee, trust me model, which is I'm going to do what I want and you keep voting for me. Or the delegate model, where I'm going to vote what wishes you have in order to keep from making you mad and not voting for me again. Perfect. And obviously that can be popular, but sometimes you're going to have more information, and especially more classified information or confidential information or more detailed information than the general public. So a combination of these, the Politico model, is really the idea of sometimes I'm going to do the trustee, trust me. Sometimes I'm going to vote the way my constituents want me to. And sometimes I'm going to go back and forth. That really is the Politico model. And we see a lot of that in the House and Senate today in the Congress. About 8,000 bills get introduced a year. Only a couple hundred at most ever get signed and signed by the president. The veto is very hard to override, as we know. How is it that Congress members are able to make decisions on so many of these bills? Where are they all coming from? Well, a lot of them come from letters written in by you, constituents. They also come from colleagues, ideas from caucuses, from staff members, from their own personal beliefs, from different interest groups that want them to carry certain things out, and especially from members of their party. And from time to time, the president will have an agenda that they want to push forth and have the members of Congress introduce. Because remember, who can introduce a bill in Congress? Anybody can write a bill, but who can introduce it? It has to be a member of Congress of that body. In the House, you have to be a House member in order to introduce a bill in the House, and the same holds true in the Senate. So why is it Americans have such a low view of Congress? Well, because they love their member of Congress. They do so much for me. I call their office because I didn't get my Social Security check, and boy, they get on the phone with Social Security Administration. They get me my check FedExed out the next day. Man, they really just made it happen. They're just amazing people. I would vote for them for a million years. But the rest of Congress, they're bums. Throw them out. I don't want them. I don't want them in there anymore, and the rest of America shouldn't either. We look at them in the abstract. We don't look at them as people. We look at them as a body that is dysfunctional and do nothing. And we've heard that ever since the days of FDR and Harry Truman. Do nothing Congresses. And we heard President Trump call them do nothing Congress not that long ago on the House side. So we see Congress always is kind of the scapegoat when it comes to low approval ratings. The president's usually somewhere in the middle, and usually the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, has a higher among the three. But a lot of people don't want what Congress, they don't want what Congress is doing. They either they want Congress to do everything and they don't want to pay for it, or they think Congress is doing too much already and needs to stop. But this is why it's really easy to not like things that you or organizations in which you don't know the people. Oh, I love my member of Congress. I give them money every election season, and I would vote for them, and I get my friends to vote for them. But anybody else, no way. So that's why they have such a low approval rating, and I think it's even lower now than it was then in 2016. At any rate, these are the highlights. I hope you found them helpful. And good luck on the upcoming test, and live the 5. Viva el 5. We'll see you soon.